Friends, we're going to get started in about 2 or 3 minutes. Well, welcome back to the final day of this year's Institute of Liturgical Studies. We're glad that you are sticking with us. It's a lovely day outside. Our final plenary is being presented by Dr. Kimberly Belcher of the University of Notre Dame. I'm going to start with a personal story. She was teaching our graduate seminar on sacramental theology. I was the only Lutheran in the room, and I can't even remember what prompted this question from my Nigerian Roman Catholic priest friend, Ken, who all of a sudden was very intent on knowing where Lutherans thought Jesus went after the Eucharist had concluded. And I stumbled with some responses in the moment, but finally I said, at Valpo we consume all the remaining bread, and we treat everything with respect, but to be quite honest, that's really not a question that we're interested in asking. And he kept pressing and pressing and pressing in a friendly way. Ken and I are good friends. And finally, Kim, as we called her, students called her, intervened and said, Ken, the Eastern Church isn't really interested in that question either, but for some reason we never badger them about it. It's only the Lutherans that we badger, or something to that effect. Dr. Belcher embodies a posture of gracious ecumenism. She serves as the Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, as I've said, and in 2025 was the and president of the immediate past president of the North American Academy of Liturgy. Her research, and in that capacity was responsible for bringing the NAAL to Valpo for their 2025 meeting last January. For which we are grateful. Yeah. She researches liturgical theology, ritual studies, and ecumenism. She serves on the Vital Worship, Vital Preaching Board of the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship and represents the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on the Methodist Catholic, Episcopal Catholic, and Pentecostal Catholic dialogues in the United States. Recent publications include Ritual Techniques in Affliction Rites and the Lutheran Catholic Ecumenical Liturgy of Lund 2016. Yearbook for Ritual and Liturgical Studies, published in 2022, and Eucharist and Receptive Ecumenism from Thanksgiving to Communion, Cambridge, 2020. Kim's talk is the final plenary for this year, but her talk is also jump-starting us for our 2026 meeting, where we will be meeting under the theme, The Feast of Creation, Liturgy in the Anthropocene. I invite you to welcome Dr. Kimberly Hope Belcher.
What a lovely introduction. I had completely forgotten that that ever happened, but I'm glad it did. And it's nice to be reminded. And I thought, oh yeah, I definitely did say that. I definitely would say it again. So it is really lovely to be here with all of you. And the main thesis of this talk is that doing ritual in a crisis with people who believe different things is really hard. And I thought maybe I would just sit down at this point, because that's something that we all know. But I feel that would probably not be, what Jim was looking for. So I thought I would see how long I could go on telling you things that you already know. And so here are a couple more things that you already know. The society that we live in is not only pluralized and contains people that have really different worldviews that nonetheless come together to pray, but is also deeply polarized, and in many cases doesn't even want to talk about the things that divide them. So that's something that we all know, right? And another thing is that the communities that we live and work in and try to serve are right now faced with not one crisis, but actually like an uncountable number of overlapping crisis events. And they need to do something about all of them and can't. And that's falling on all of us. So how's that for things that we all know already? So I want to say that because one of the things that's really hard, there are many things that are very hard about ritualizing in a crisis, but the thing that struck me the most, and this is a book project that I've been working on now for 7 years-ish. But the thing that has struck me the most is that ritualizing in a crisis is so contextual. It's really about receiving the crisis and then selecting or making up things that are actually an answer to the community's needs at that moment. And so I'm not going to do a talk on best practices in response to crisis. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us 3 examples of crisis that functions at different levels, and how a ritual in response to each of these crises that is selective and made up and addresses people who don't buy into a Christian worldview, at least in any explicit way, were, in my judgment, successful. And then what does it mean for those ritual events to be successful? Today I'll be highlighting some examples that rely on space and spatial movement. In this, I am in part trying to take seriously Sarah's proposed shift from day one to the material, emotional, and relational aspects of liturgy when we engage with occasional practitioners, and, because not all of these are occasional practitioners, others who straddle the boundaries of a liturgical life world. And I'm going to be thinking about different worldviews. So the one thing that unites these 3 very different rituals that we're going to look at is that they all have people participating in them who have widely disparate worldviews, and nobody checks in about what those worldviews are before you come. And so this is in part my response to Sarah's request that we think about how not to be guardians of our liturgical resources, but instead to be kenotic. Today I'm going to talk about 3 different levels of crisis, and I roughly measure them by how many people are experiencing an event as a crisis. So in the first, the personal up at the top there, an individual perhaps has died or become critically ill or lost a job or developed an addiction. And only one person is directly affected by the crisis event, even though their inner circle will also be affected, possibly in a way that registers as a crisis in its own right. At the same time, it's still just one person that's directly impacted. Some crises impact a whole social group, which means a group that has something in common, but is too large to know one another personally. For example, the opiate crisis in the United States, which was really in the news when I first started writing this book and is really out of the news now, could be seen as a large number of independent addiction crises, but it is not that. There are common causes, states of life, and risks that unite numerous people that don't all know each other. And so if we ritualize as if each instance of this was personal, we'll be missing a lot of the possible ramifications that we could be having. So an example on that when I get to part 2, the social part. The social crisis does, however, spawn a number of personal crises, and all those personal crises demand remediation at different levels. Other examples include anti-Black racism, which is the main focus of the second part of this talk, and homelessness among war veterans and others. At a third level, eco-catastrophes are crises that have both causes and impacts beyond humans. So earthquakes and natural disasters, for example, impact multiple social groups. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was a crisis for the whole city of New Orleans and surrounding areas, but it was also much worse for residents who were Black, impoverished, elderly, or all 3. Eco-catastrophes often spawn or exacerbate social crises, as well as numerous personal crises. They create challenges to our very survival, since they often affect the supply of the material things that we need to live. In this conference, we've questioned extensively something we perhaps were trained to take for granted, that normally everyone who practices ritual together has the same cosmology and values and the same purpose for the ritual. Sarah's plenary, for example, highlighted how occasional participants might not only bring lenses from a different ritual system, but also be motivated by a crisis, even if for their ministers a baptism seems routine. In a pluralistic environment, our ability to provide space, and in my examples, providing space is very literal, for people who are experiencing the rite from different perspectives is critical for producing a meaningful experience and eventually some mutual understanding of what the rite is supposed to be doing. When I say pluralism, I am referring to a society where there's no consensus on the physical and social structures of the created world we experience. This actually affects all of us, even if we believe very firmly in the Christian worldview. Instead of supposing that our rituals reflect the worldview of every individual that participates in it, we can suppose that ritual projects an as-if or a subjunctive world like a theater does. Participants don't need to buy into the premise that the world is literally true any more than they do in a theater. They might reject the worldview outright. They might accept it as a possibility, but hold belief in reserve. They may not know whether they believe or not. They may fully buy in to the narrative and later reject it. Perhaps most likely of all, they may wait until they talk to their friends and neighbors after the service to really decide whether they believe it or not. This agency to interpret has played a huge role in resistance to oppression among marginalized peoples who are coerced into oppressive ritual systems, and for this reason, we shouldn't wish it was otherwise. The Broadway musical Hadestown, for me, has been a useful example of a projected and subjunctive world. The libretto connects the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice to the climate crisis. Weather ain't the way it was before, ain't no spring or fall at all anymore. It's either blazing hot or freezing cold, laments Eurydice in her opening number. This song, Anais Mitchell says, originated as, quote, apocalyptic impressionist poetry, written in response to her experiences of hurricanes and childbearing. Over the course of the play, it is revealed that the seasons are wrong because of a crisis of memory. Hades and Persephone have forgotten the song of their love. I do not literally believe in Hades and Persephone, let alone that Hades is a dastardly industrialist, but I nonetheless found some revelation of my own world in this play, particularly when I went to see the production on Broadway in 2021. Orpheus and Eurydice end the way they always do, with Orpheus emerging into the light, looking back too soon, and losing Eurydice forever. The audience in the theater gasped in unison, hundreds of people gasping at once when Orpheus turned. I even gasped, which surprised me. I not only know the story, which I assume everyone in that theater did, but I had actually listened to the soundtrack at least 100 times, including on the way to the theater that day. I knew that this was the moment. I knew that it was coming, and I knew that it was here. And yet, being gathered with hundreds of strangers, watching an exquisite production live for the first time, I and the entire audience somehow hoped that this one night, and that's the gift of live theater and of liturgy, that this one night they might make it out. That is the power of the performances that we've inherited, even for people who don't take them literally. I also need to define a crisis for you. And I'm using the Disaster Ritual anthology and an essay by Paul Post, who says that events are more likely to cause a crisis when they are unexpected, undesirable, unimaginable, unmanageable, or undeserved. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but I think it's important to think for a minute about unmanageable and unimaginable. So take grandmother's death. Grandmother's death may have been unexpected because she wasn't ill, but if it also threw you into poverty, it is unmanageable because it took away the resources that you were using to survive. If you also discovered at that moment that something that always seemed like an unchangeable part of your identity, like your parents or your family history or your race or religion, had been concealed from you, that might make your crisis unimaginable. Unimaginable events change how you think about who you are and who are your people. A crisis, then, is the consequence of an event that is so unexpected, undesirable, unimaginable, unmanageable, or undeserved that it overwhelms our ability to handle it using our usual resources. Some kinds of events are especially prone to creating a crisis. Mark Rosine, for example, shows how earthquakes, like climate crisis, are experienced as a complete dissolution of the world one depends on. Quote, earthquakes can create the impression that the world itself has become unstable or that it is about to fall apart. This was an especially serious threat in 5th century Constantinople, where the city was understood to be a microcosm of the whole creation. Intellectuals, quote, conceived of the cosmos as a unified whole, a harmonious organism whose purpose was to glorify God, and which was represented in a privileged way by Constantinople itself. The liturgy, as a response to an earthquake crisis, quote, presented earthquakes not only as fractures in the land, but also as rifts in the human environment and divine relationship. Maybe that's something that we can relate to every day now, whether there's an earthquake or not. One way that societies respond to crises is by creating new ritual practices, generally out of the parts that are available to them from the rituals they already know. Rosine, for example, talks about the commemorative, quote, procession, mimicking the evacuation during the earthquake of 438, which followed the same path as the evacuation route and included both newly composed and established hymnody. These new practices are sometimes called ritualization. They are often emerging, exploratory, improvised, new, or radically repurposed. Compared to existing strains of ritual like the ones in our books, ritualization relies less on authorization or scripts or training. It can feel interruptive, uncomfortable, foreign, and inauthentic. Nonetheless, it can permit the experience of a projected world, one that perhaps matters, maybe to you or maybe to people you love. It can allow also a society to question its assumed norms or respond to a crisis by allowing new possibilities to be enacted and evaluated. Similarly, I'm going to avoid, oops, sorry, this was probably before. Sorry about that. So one of the things that's important when we look at emerging rituals, and you're going to see this diagram throughout, so I'm going to stop and explain it for a minute here, is that we have on the left side emerging ritual actions, which people sort of make up, and or they take them apart and from many different things, and they might be uncomfortable. And then people go out of the liturgy, this is why I was talking about this earlier, and they decide whether they liked it or not. And that part is especially uncomfortable for us. But that's actually a really critical point, because people are exposed in these types of liturgies that respond to crisis to new ideas about who they are and what kinds of problems and solutions are at hand. And so then they develop new preferences, values, fears, and hopes as a response to those conversations that are a response to the ritual. They take their new preferences, values, fears, and hopes back into the ritual. You might notice that this means we can't do one ritual and solve the problem. I actually avoid using the terminology of rites of healing, even in my own Roman Catholic context, because it tends to suggest to our imagination that we should be able to do one ritual and resolve a crisis, or at least we should be able to come out of it and go, did it work? In anthropology, the category instead that's used is affliction rites, which I think is much more productive. It's a much more expansive concept that describes rites responding to any kind of affliction. One begins the process of a rite of affliction because one perceives a misfit between what is and what ought to be. But then the cause of that misfit, for example, is it sin? Is it physical disease? Is it social injustice? Might only be diagnosed once we begin a ritual intervention and actually hear one another's evaluations of the ritual that we perform together. The distinction is important, lest we expect that every crisis will suddenly be fully saved by our ritual. In fact, all rituals, but especially emerging rituals in crisis situations, are important in part because of the ways they allow people to engage in conversation around questions of meaning, something that our polarized world doesn't like. When we talk about the impact of a ritual, then we should consider the questions it evokes as much as the answers that it provides. Emerging rituals are important in a crisis because they naturally evoke conversations that allow a community to reflect on the event, the crisis, and possible responses. And the fact that they didn't like the ritual does not mean that it didn't work. It also doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to what they didn't like about it. Listening is an important part of this cycle. Though it may be uncomfortable for us as ritual experts, the conversations that begin with the question of whether the rite was satisfying play an important role in navigating a crisis. In short, emerging ritual is actually not just thoughts and prayers. I've been wanting to say that out loud for so many years now. For this reason, ritual planning together, even with people who don't seem to know anything about the ritual that they're planning, including selecting from among their repertoire and bridging the instigator's ritual systems, if it's at all possible, is a critical tool. It not only helps people feel better, but more importantly, it helps people develop agency in responding to crisis and establish community ties within a crisis situation. And now for something completely different. I have been playing Lord of the Rings online for almost 15 years. It is a role-playing game. In addition to programmed characters, there are characters controlled by other real people that I can meet. And 15 years is a long time, even online and even, not without interruption, to get to know people. So now there are numerous people that I know to a greater or lesser extent because we have spent hours together solving tricky puzzles, fighting fictional dragons, or playing music. The vast majority of these relationships take place exclusively in the game, which means they are almost exclusively conducted through in-game text chat and shared in-game experiences. For example, at one point, I was weekly making a friend's grandmother's adobo recipe from the Philippines, and yet I only knew him as Sam from California. In 2015, a friend in the game messaged me to let me know that a close friend of hers, who I had met several times, had died in real life. Her character's name was Ro. I never knew her real name, but I had been to parties she had hosted in which players cooperatively improvised stories about their characters. The deceased player died young. My friend, whose real name and location I also do not know even to this day, I still talk to her, was going to host a wake for Ro in-game. She posted an invitation with the time and the place, that is, in the game place, in the online forums. The only instructions were, we're going to have a wake. I am attending to try to support this friend. I log in a little late that night because of a competing obligation. When the game loads, I first open the social panel, which you see here, and look to see which of my friends are online. This isn't mine, it's somebody's online. Then I put on my character's social dress, wouldn't do to go in armor, from her clothing options, and travel to Rivendell. The Hall of Fire is a long room in Elrond's house, ornately decorated with gilded floral motifs, dominated by 3 huge fireplaces at one end of the room and 2 enormous tables in its midst. The floor in the center of the room is a sunken tiled floor, very shiny. I know this room has music, a muted strings and vocal arrangement, but I have the music in my game turned off right now. The players who spend a lot of time with Ro are also invested in Lotro's in-game player-controlled music, and I want to be able to hear the music they are playing. This means that despite the crowd in the room, and this was obviously taken at another time, I didn't think to take screenshots this night. Despite the crowd in the room, when I walk in, the only audio I hear with my ears is my own footsteps, or rather, my avatar's footsteps. I specify with my ears because I have a kind of learned synesthesia in Lotro. When I enter, my eyes are instinctively scanning the chat window that is at the lower left of the screen before I even take in the visual image of people gathered in the middle. We don't hear players' voices in the game. I can only hear the people who have gathered for this wake in the Hall of Fire by reading the words and gestures they type into the chat. Interpreting these as the player's own words and gestures has become effortless. There is, of course, a lot of death in an RPG. Players might kill a dozen monsters to complete a single quest, and maybe hundreds or thousands to go up a level. Storylines feature characters whose story has been told to lead up to a predictable death scene that you saw several weeks ago was coming. Player characters die regularly too, and resurrect one another to start again. It might be reasonable to assume that in this context, death would be held cheap. Instead, Ro's wake was painfully sincere. People typed /mourn and /cry, which make the avatar bury its face in its hands like this. Shoulders shaking with grief. They typed awkward tributes to Rose's kindness and sense of humor in the game chat to be seen by others in the room. They used /hug to comfort her especially close friends. They were confronted, and in some ways more confronted than in a real life space, by the inadequacy of what we can say or do in the face of every incalculable loss. In addition to revealing the fragility of life in a way that all funerals, but especially those of the young, do, the wake revealed a special fragility of the community enabled by the game. People regularly disappear from this pastime for weeks or months, just not starting the game. Most of the time, they're busy with work or family, have had a computer problem, or have found a new hobby. But we wonder. Sam from California was gone a few nights, not at his kids' activities, as I'd assumed, but undergoing emergency heart surgery, which I found out only because his wife knew who I was and found me on Facebook to send me a message about it. Rather than having a fixed script, Rose's wake was cooperatively pieced together from behaviors people remembered seeing or using at similar events. The game medium also imposed a very severe restriction on our bodies. In a real wake, participants understood, people embrace one another and offer handshakes. They hear human voices and music, and they are surrounded by a three-dimensional world. But the game environment relies almost completely on the visual and this learned synesthesia that I've been talking about. Players in the game were only able to experience this ritual as a ritual because they had significant practice imagining that they occupy the body of their avatar and experience what it does. This has a leveling effect for many players with chronic illness or mobility disabilities. The game's constraints mean they are equally abled with everyone else in the game. Many of them will talk about this. At the same time, it is limiting, and it is especially limiting in emotional moments that demand spontaneity. And I say this in part to give us another view from the outside of what we're asking when we ask people to show up to our rituals and participate. It's a hard thing to do. So Rose's wake was invented on the fly out of the various memories of wakes experienced in person, in media, or in literature by a group of people from various places. Yet it bore enough resemblance to those rituals to be recognizable, I judge, to everyone, and to touch the emotions. What do people know that they can bring to bear on a crisis in terms of ritual practice? Well, they know enough, actually, even if what they know isn't always what we would like them to know. Did the wake work? It was very moving to the individual who suggested the event, and I have her quotation up here. Of course, the wake might not have been equally moving to everyone there. Perhaps not everyone who typed /mourn was literally mourning. A participant might have a mix of sorrow, compassion, obligation, curiosity, and boredom, and still judge that they had done a good thing by showing up. This is true also of participation in our liturgical resources. In addition to a range of different emotions, Rose's wake tolerated a variety of different worldviews. In Rose's wake, people used different models of the afterlife to talk about her destiny. Some were intentionally fanciful. I don't even know how to pronounce that word, so I'm not going to read this. Some were Christian phrases that we use very widely in North America. Many spoke of never forgetting her, and a few even identified her with the community that was gathered to remember her. Still, the preferred language for the afterlife during the wake drew from Tolkien's fictional world. Not from the fate of humans, which actually his theology of death is really interesting, but from the special destiny of elves and ring bearers who go over the sea to the undying lands. I instinctively did the same, echoing the language used by those around me and even doing a light adaptation of Bobby Darin's Beyond the Sea in Rose's memory. When I talked about this experience afterwards, using that interpretive cycle, oh no, I don't have it here. What a shame. Someone asked me whether I felt strange using this metaphor of passing beyond the sea rather than sticking to language that more closely reflects my own worldview. At that moment, however, it seemed more important to me to be in solidarity with the assembly and with those who were deeply mourning than it was to express more unambiguously my belief. I was, too, able to project into the fiction my worldview, my own eschatology, and that seemed enough at this moment, and still seems enough to me in retrospect. Let's talk about social crisis. These transitions are really what I worked hard on, you can tell. I went to the George Floyd Global Memorial on November 5th, 2022. The fist and a sign that reads, "You are now entering the free state of George Floyd," murals reading, "This is a place of love, you changed the world, George," and RIP, and the barricades that keep out automobile traffic set aside the space for a distinctive set of purposes, but don't tell you what they are. This impression is reinforced by the repurposing of mundane urban furniture to commemorate the dead. My favorite is this abandoned bus station with George Floyd's face on it. So that's what you're seeing here. At one end of the memorial, there is a handwritten piece of cardboard that you can see that says in large capitals, "This is sacred space." At the other end is an official brown highway sign that says Historic George Floyd Memorial. Between them, the memorial is a sprawling spiral of signs, silk flowers, teddy bears, candles, prayer beads, all showing the wear of months in the sun and rain. At the epicenter of this memorial is a large floor, I think I have these out of order, nope, is a large floor mural of Floyd against a sky blue background, his head in his hands, wearing a crown and wings. The words on the mural say, "Mama, I can't breathe." Rituals tend to be characterized by superabundance and differentiated repetition, and my guess is we're not used to seeing street memorials as a liturgy. But this space is flooded with symbolic items expressing various motifs. If you take the foreground, for example, or you take, I gave you this photo instead. If you take this photo, for example, you can see a collection of candles that are all different, but are all burned. So all different looking candles. There's no aesthetic unity, but there is a unity of ritual action, and that's what we often see at these memorials. We saw in the first plenary how broad and diffuse the meaning of candles can be in contemporary North America. And so this kind of motif pattern uses a language that cuts across multiple ritual systems to speak of lament. The images, mostly of George Floyd's face, and slogans that are used similarly are characterized by fragments of the same images and words that appear over and over, superabundantly, almost overwhelming you, but with a great deal of variation and room for interpretation. There are hand-painted signs and pieces of art as well, each personal and at the same time variations on well-established themes. And there are prayer beads, many rosaries and types of prayer beads that I can't recognize. Prayer beads and candles become a kind of condensation of an invisible action of prayer, making it something that lasts and takes up space. In the context of a ritualized memorial like this one, the superabundant provision of symbolic items calls attention to the individual insufficiency of each particular offering. Flowers and candles are conventional memorials for the dead, but their profusion in this block of claimed space long after Floyd's death suggests that even a cloud of these candles and flowers cannot fully express the loss of Floyd and the others whose names appear all over the memorial site. The ritual language of a profusion of candles, flowers, beads, and arts is very familiar in the Christian tradition, and our recognition of Jesus as an undeserving victim of state violence also resonates with the shrine's symbolic imagery. At the same time, candles, flowers, beads, and art, as well as violence against the unarmed, are interpretable across religions and non-religion in North America. In short, the memorial ritualizes Floyd's death as that of a martyr in a language that can be interpreted in pluralistic urban North America in various ways. They also point toward the act of offering by many individuals, ritually denoting that the death of this one man matters to many and has resulted in a community of many people. Even without agreement on a cosmology or a ritual vernacular or whatever, the shrine to George Floyd demonstrates consensus that his death provoked a crisis. Unexpected, undesirable, unimaginable, unmanageable, and undeserved. And not only to his immediate family and the local community, but in some way to the world. Without individuals coming to agree in advance about the meaning of the rite, it articulates certain beliefs about this event and its consequences. The same differentiated repetition marks the other objects of the memorial too: silk flowers, stuffed toys. There are easily hundreds of stuffed toys at the memorial, all a bit weathered, but not enough to have been there since 2020. So we can imagine that offering these items is a quiet ritual action that keeps going. But what happens when you have people that keep putting objects in a space that are degrading over time? So this was a mystery that made me seek out eventually Janelle Austin, who is the executive director of the George Floyd Global Memorial, and is the ritual expert who does the curation of the site. And I want us to think about curation as an alternate model. I know we don't all love the word curation. Just try to do a blank slate with me for a minute if you hate this word. Think of an art museum, your favorite art museum. So we're all in this room ritual experts. We're not grassroots, like at least not in the same ways. So we have a role to play as well. And I think looking at the curation that happens at this is actually quite helpful. In March 2023, I met with Janelle Austin. Her role overseeing local volunteers is to curate the offerings that are brought to the memorial, represent the local community in its now global network of relationships of meaning, and interpret the memorial to the public. Austin has an MDiv degree in Christian ethics and an MA in intercultural studies from Fuller Theological Seminary. So it's not just a grassroots memorial. As executive director of the George Floyd Global Memorial, she receives both the narratives and the material offerings of the grassroots, local, and global community. She curates the development of a broader consensus, expressed spatially at the shrine and narratively in her public appearances. She, too, is a ritual expert, curating rather than safeguarding, exchanging gifts with, and interpreting the offerings of the local community. The shrine's existence repositions Floyd. This is no longer an expression of grief by mourners who knew Floyd and miss his presence in their lives, as that first example we looked at. Rather, the shrine's ritualization posits Floyd as a symbolic ancestor, a claim that visitors to the shrine or those who are reading the news article can choose to accept or reject. This is most explicit in the existence of a simulated cemetery around the corner from the shrine in an old retention pond. It was only 3 days after All Souls when I visited, and I still had the reading of names in my mind. This is my example of exchange of gifts with this shrine. So when I saw the letters spelling "say their names" on the side of this hill, I turned that way, walked up and down the rows of the memorial, saying the names of the dead aloud. This cemetery-like area reminded me also of All Saints' Eve at St. John's Abbey, where I was just before I went to the George Floyd Global Memorial. St. Peregrine, who's in this glass reliquary here, is probably just as difficult for 21st century to take as a symbolic ancestor, or more difficult than Floyd. A child martyr from about 192 CE in Rome, he was also put to death by state violence with 3 companions. They were not tortured because the state wanted them to reject Christ. but instead because the state wanted them to reveal the wealth that had been donated to the church so they could steal it. Other Roman officials, including their jailer and one of their torturers, also converted to the Christian faith. Their witness under torment was effective not because they had intellectual arguments and could recite the Nicene Creed, but because their patient endurance and even joy under suffering convinced those who listened that the Christ who conquered death was genuinely upholding them. In short, they were also relational and emotional in their practice of the faith. Like Floyd, Peregrine and his companions were remembered by the living after their death and served to strengthen others in their resistance to state injunctions against the community's gatherings. Despite manifest differences, the continuities of these two ancestries can deepen our understanding of both. Even in a pluralistic cultural surround like Minneapolis, a shared eschatology can be found, a shared hope, though it isn't always in Christian terminology. When I first saw the greenhouse that is in the back of those earlier pictures I showed you of the shrine, I assumed it would be locked. That's on me. It's not locked. When I walked in, I was stunned to go from the cold wetness of the street to the warm wetness of what immediately seemed to be paradise. Every greenhouse in Minnesota in November is paradise. There are numerous flowers and plants, there are tools, and there are images of the dead in this greenhouse. A little vision of paradise that is expressed in imagery and that is read and can be read by people with very different cosmologies. And this greenhouse is at the center of a community that is still actively taking care of each other, which I think is something we often doubt about the ritual centers that we see in the world. Like I said, the transitions are great. So now the ecological level. Agency and allowing narrative, emotional, and relational participation can permit profound emerging rituals across tensions about worldview here as well. So here's an example. There are many indigenous and pre-modern life worlds or cosmologies, including our Christian cosmology, that understand the earth to be animate and to have its own dignity and agency. In fact, we sang about this in morning. We sang this in morning prayer today. I know I'm on solid ground. For example, we already said that. But this is an especially heavy lift in the pluralistic surround in North America right now. As a result, our rituals and our discourse surrounding climate change is sometimes limited to exploring the impact on human populations, which I think is just not good enough. In that context, I got very interested in one account of a glacier funeral in Iceland. And I'm going to read this aloud. I know some of you can't read it, but you can also, there's a link on the slideshow to look at the slides later if you want to. An emergent ritual response to climate change. Lisa Sideris, a religious studies and environmental studies scholar, argues in an essay that grief or loss orientation, we might call it lament, is an essential response to loss in the Anthropocene, to be contrasted with what she calls the distinctively forward-facing orientation of can-do narratives that seek to repair environmental damage and cast humans as heroes. With respect to animal extinction, for example, such narratives focus on how human beings might facilitate de-extinction through artificial reproductive technology instead of lamenting animals that are extinct already. This is in the news this week. After advocating for looking back or grief or lament, Sideris proceeds to narrate a secondhand account of a glacier funeral that metaphorically contradicts the whole argument of her paper. This is why I got interested. This is exactly the opposite of what you're claiming. A funeral rite for the vanished glacier was held in August 2019 and included a solemn hike up OK Mountain where the glacier had once lived. Howe and Boyer, accompanied by a group of mourners, ascended the mountain. The mourners included Howe and Boyer's young daughter, as well as other children. Also present were the Prime Minister of Iceland, various scholars and artists, and a glaciologist who presented an official death certificate. The ceremony for OK entailed a long walk up the mountain, culminating in the installation of the commemorative plaque. The last 100 meters of the procession took place in silence, in accordance with Icelandic tradition. Tradition also dictates that climbers may make 3 wishes as they silently approach the summit, and that they are not to look backward as they ascend. Climbers who obey these rules are said to have their wishes fulfilled. OK's rocky terrain made the hike physically challenging, and as Howe explains, she was not certain from one moment to the next whether her daughter had been able to keep up and was still somewhere close behind her. She wanted desperately to turn around, but also wished to respect the custom of forward-facing silence. On Howe's own interpretation of the ritual, this is all quoted from Sideris, ascending the mountain became a, quote, metaphor for moving forward in the climatological apocalypse. We have to keep moving forward, she says, with whatever kinds of solutions we can come up with. Yet the injunction to keep going was frustrating as she became increasingly worried about her daughter's progress somewhere behind her. Finally, still facing forward, she tentatively extended her hand backward, not knowing who was behind her or how they might react. A second later, she says, she felt her daughter's small hand grasp her own. I started crying. I use this dramatic retelling of Sideris's in part because I was intrigued to find that she acknowledges that her emotional response is quite different from the one that Howe is providing on the podcast that she's actually quoting here. Quote, Howe's retelling of the story is on the whole much more lighthearted and jocular than my narration here. Nevertheless, I found the story very moving. She empathetically reinterprets this narrative. Howe and Boyer, who are anthropologists at Rice University, initiated this funeral because they wanted to replace the life-non-life binary, characteristic of our modern worldview, with a continuum from sentient to non-living beings. This work follows the way indigenous Icelanders have thought about glaciers. Quote, while Icelandic folk traditions do not take mountains or glaciers as sentient beings per se, there has been a long tradition of belief in the sentient occupation and guardianship of mountains and rocks by spirits and non-human beings like Huldufolk in the near-human landscape. Similarly, local people may sense a broken bond between wounded environments and the human responsibility and commitment to them. So just a little context. A glacier is a glacier because it is thick enough and therefore heavy enough to move on its own, like the one that's pictured here. Okiakulk's funeral was held because the ice was no longer heavy enough to do this. It is simple enough, actually, to see how a massive, dangerous, beautiful co-inhabitant that moves under its own power would be considered animate. At the same time, it's interesting to me that Howe and Boyer do not actually anthropomorphize this glacier in the academic article in which they express that anthropomorphizing the glacier is their real goal. Instead, they say, quote, the equivocations between the living and the dead, the vital and the inanimate is, we find, an especially generative space of reflection for the Anthropocene age, when all living beings depend, as they always have, on non-living matter, but now also face unprecedented challenges for species survival, that's the living again, related to disruptions to Earth systems, that's the glacier. It took instigating a funeral ritual for a glacier that they didn't believe was really living for Howe and Boyer to, at least in a fragile and amorphous way, acknowledge the glacier as a meaningful inhabitant of the landscape, a creature and not a symptom. Howe and Boyer spotlight in this article the role of memory in glaciers. Quoting glaciologist Otter Sigurdsson, glaciers are both incredibly beautiful and impressive in the environment and an intriguing part of nature. And last but not least, they are superbly knowledgeable about history. Now we're getting closer. They conserve the history of Iceland, and we have yet to study it. That history is conserved in the layers of the glacier, both the amount of rain, dust, isotopes, and ash layers, and this story we must collect before the glaciers melt. We can say that in some way we are losing 5 years of our history every year. This was 6 years ago. By participating in a procession in a glacier funeral, the hikers wrote upon the landscape a narrative that inscribes a past, animate glacier, and an apocalyptic vision of the future. Even without individuals knowing whether they believe in the mountain as animate, and maybe none of them fully did, the ritual enacted a respect for its dignity. By following the custom of not looking back, Howe respected the mountain, whether or not she could coherently integrate it as a living being in her own worldview. The moment also embodied a participation for her in the glacier's vulnerability by uniting her familial relationships and her concern for her daughter with the fragility of the local landscape. Many residents of North America might struggle to articulate a belief in creation as animate and worthy of respectful treatment in its own right, but they can act in accordance with that knowledge in a ritual environment and consider the challenges it offers to their worldview. What makes it possible for the ritualization of this entirely novel, indeed made-up ritual? They clearly did not have a liturgist on board this project, I will say. To overcome the ingrained assumption that landscapes are not sentient, agentive, or live. First, the existence of overlapping ritual systems makes it possible to ritualize in an as-if fictionalized or projective fashion. By overlapping systems in this case, I mean specifically actions, images, or symbolic objects that have a place and a meaning within both systems. As we heard from Sarah Monday, these meanings can be in tension, or they can reinforce one another, or both. For example, Siderus uses terms hike, climbers, and long walk, rather than the liturgical terms procession or pilgrimage, as I probably would have done. And Howe and Boyer organized the ritual after being laughed at by a tourism company. That's my favorite little detail of this story. In conjunction with the Icelandic Hiking Society. That's who was gathered at this rite. The embodied possibilities of ritualizing in this way have been maintained by the secular practice of hiking, and its language permits the performance of the proper ritual without fully demanding an answer to the question of whether the rite is real. I just realized this is such an echo of the narrative you told in my introduction. That's great. This possibility of fictional participation takes us back again to Broadway and Hadestown. In particular, and in fact, part of the impact of the hike on Siderus derives from Howe's perhaps unconscious, not sure, echo of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice in her retelling. Siderus writes, quote, "He turns to look at Eurydice, but it is too soon. She is in shadow. It seems that there is no comfort whatsoever in this story of crisis and shattered hope, of grief compounded by a second wave of irrevocable loss. Other myths similarly warn us of the dangers of looking over our shoulder toward the past. But I wonder if we might be wrong to read these tales as simple injunctions against looking back. It's not that she comes to a coherent answer, but the highly symbolic spatial metaphors of looking forward and looking back become, through the practice of this ritual, useful symbols for thinking through the question of what our responsibility is in the climate crisis today. So, the three things that come together are the ritual Icelandic custom that prohibits looking back, which Howe obeys without believing that there's any sufficient reason she should do so, the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and then the relational concerns of a parent for a child, and they come together to create a new framework for thinking about how we should consider our responsibilities in the Anthropocene age. Should we be looking back or should we be looking forward? In what proportions and in what ways? Which I think is a really interesting and helpful addition to our conversations about the crisis. Conclusion. Nathan Chase, in a study of pilgrimage to the Holy Land, introduces the notion of, quote, anamnetic or ritual load, and the way that being in a holy space can lighten this load. I find this helpful for thinking about how people can be enabled to participate together in rituals that not only responds to their sense of crisis, but can also permit the development of new ideas. The ritual load of liturgies that are held in the time of crisis is very high, as we said at the beginning. Because the whole point of what we mean by crisis is that our world of experience is coming apart. The load is even increased within a pluralistic environment, where participants do not inherit, as ancient Constantinopolitans did, a sense that space already maps out a set of relationships between God, humanity, and the cosmos. At the same time, as ritual experts, we have many things at our disposal that we're maybe not fully aware of. We are working within diverse communities that have numerous ritual concepts, meaningful material aids, and narrative fragments within their life worlds that they can bring to bear on these crises. If we listen to and receive that experience, as Sarah and Melinda have suggested, we can become curators of those offerings instead of guardians of an unbending tradition. We can practice our own ritual repertoire canonically, as in baptisms. We can permit agency in receiving ritual fragments and in planning ritual. We can consider the environment of our ritual responses as a critical actor. We can consider the process of praying in pluralistic assemblies as an exchange of gifts, preserving and displaying in differentiated repetition all the treasures from the storehouse, old and new. We can permit exploratory and fictional participation, motivated by love and respect for other humans as a step on the way to a consensus. We can focus on physical movement, not words, as a mode of understanding our world. We can participate after the earth-shaking impact of a crisis in the fragile reconstruction of hope. Most of all, we can work with and within our communities to develop new interpretations of crisis situations that allow for change. And thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kim. Kim will be back here at 1:30 during the workshop sessions. There are other workshops, as you see in your booklets. I invite you to return here if you'd like or seek something else. Have a great lunch.